Hey, welcome to 23 Degrees Sideways, Coyote on the Plateau. Let's talk about cultural nationalism, nationalism in general, civic nationalism, all this stuff, groups and groupiness, and how that relates to your enlightenment and your sense of self and your sense of belonging and all of that. So one of the things to note, of course, is that cultural nationalism is only allowable in the modern academic media discourse sense if you are not American or European. Really weird, really interesting, and absolutely counterproductive. This is kind of a problem, especially when you get into community support, supportiveness, healthy forms of nationalism and enlightenment. So in Japan, for example, there's a difference between, there's these weird words for all these things because they actually talk about this stuff. Cultural nationalism versus a state-directed nationalism. And of course there's overlap between the two, especially when you go back pre-war, after about like 1870 and on, there's an idea of the combination of cultural and state-sponsored nationalism. It just kind of got all mingled up together, just like Buddhism and Shintoism in Japan often did. However, as with Buddhism and Shintoism being mingled together, the Buddhist bureaucracies and hierarchies took over. So that happens often when you get the mingling of the state-sponsored nationalism, which is actually part of the topic, so we'll get there. Cultural nationalism is a kind of a cultural identity, importances and things about your culture that give you an identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of caring. Now, all of that is doable in a positive sense and a negative sense. And there's lots of positive aspects even if you're doing it in a negative sense. But here's the big difference between a positive and a negative sense, okay? And this is the one that they're not going to allow for an American or a European in any context in academic, media, modern political thought. I don't know why they're so hung up on this, but that's how they are. It's actually the big positive and negative divide right there. A positive cultural nationalism, cultural identity. And nationalism is actually very key here because it's the biggest social grouping circle that most people can get access to on a regular basis, like can comprehend, fill themselves with on a regular basis. Okay, being part of the universe, even when you're enlightened and expanded out, isn't a all the time thing necessarily. It can be, but it's not. There's levels and flows. The volume knob isn't always turned up to 11. So, there's ebbs and flows. Anyway, cultural nationalism, and nationalism being the biggest circle socially, sociologically, that people can usually handle, is a fantastic thing, right? If it's positive. If you say, hey, I'm part of this culture, I have this cultural identity, everything's cool, you've got yours, I've got mine, let's be all woo and stuff. And yeah, there's conflicts between the cultures, but the conflicts don't necessarily stem from the idea that my cultural nationalism is based on everybody else's subhuman. Okay, that's a negative cultural nationalism. That is actually, in fact, specifically what you get with modern media and academic elites, is this idea that everyone else is subhuman. If you doubt that at all, go to an urban progressive salon, coffee, cocktail party, whatever they call them now, safe space, and see how they talk about rural people. Imagine being a rural person. Show up with a southern accent. Say y'all once or twice, okay? Watch it. Watch what happens. They are the absolute provincial exemplar of the negative side of cultural nationalism, which is hilarious because they mostly tell everyone else that they are. So cultural nationalism can be a very special thing. Your special arts, your special traditions, your special stuff, your sense of belonging, your ability to care for each other. And this is absolutely critical in Enlightenment stuff, because you take someone like me, half the time I'm floating around in the clouds so much that I can't remember to feed myself or what day of the week it is. Sometimes. Doing my park bench thing. And then sometimes I come back down a little bit and I'm floating around. I'm like, ooh, yeah, that group would be really cool to be part of. Like, I'd like to have a group. I'd like to have a civic nationalism, a cultural nationalism, a thing that recognizes where I'm going in my path, and we have care for each other and stuff, and that would be really cool. Of course, we are deliberately fractured, especially with America, Western Europe, in an effort to not allow us to have that, not permit us to have that. And that includes various things like religious and social areas. Excuse the beeping there. So it's really interesting to me. So for example, if you're Japanese, you can have cultural nationalism. If you're Javanese, you can have cultural nationalism. If you're from a Native American Indian tribe, oh hell yeah, you get cultural nationalism. You should have complete national boundaries and not allow white people anywhere near you, damn it. What the hell? So cultural nationalism is allowed, especially if it's the negative sort, the exclusionary part that says we're better than you. Not exclusivity, exclusionary, excluding other people from the state of humanity. That is celebrated by, okay, this is actually a problem now that I think about it. This is one of those things that starts to become a conspiracy theory, actually. So we're not going to talk about that right now. Civic nationalism is much like cultural nationalism with a melting pot aspect. So America, the United States, celebrated throughout history for 200 and something years as the best shining light on a hill example of civic nationalism. Anyone, anywhere can come to the table, become an American, become a USian, become a America. Okay? Bring your tacos, bring your sushi, bring whatever it is your dish is, come sit at the American table. Expand our repertoire and our culture. And that is actually seen as a negative by a lot of people, and I don't really understand that either, but that's civic nationalism in a nutshell, is that you're free to join the civitas, join the civic nation. So that's a pretty big deal also, right? What else? I don't know. That's just, I wanted to talk about this a little bit because it's such a big concept and it's so overlooked, and you're not allowed to have these ideas or these thoughts or these positive aspects if you are, well, basically white in general. That's a very dangerous thing. It's a very dangerous thing because when you push that wet direction, when you push that negative that hard, you're going to get back that kind of negative, and that's where you end up with bad ideas of cultural nationalism as a response. Because, so here's the thing, in broad terms, we're not talking Enlightenment terms here, we're just talking broad social terms, like how humanity operates in groups. When you push and you threaten the survival of a group, a national culture, a cultural nation, a tribal system, whatever, when you threaten that, they're going to respond with that negative thing I talked about, a negative identity where it's like we are this special group and you are subhuman, because that's how you respond to the threat in a social context. Okay, and it doesn't matter if the threat's real or not. You just have to, and that's one of the tricks that leaders can use, is to program a threat. Once again, academics and media right now program a threat into you so that you become hyper negative in your response. But that negative response can be a survival mechanism. And it's a very natural one. Natural survival response, threat response. But what you want is a type of nationalism or civic nationalism, cultural identity that relies on confidence, competence, and acceptance, so that you're not gaining your cultural importance by putting other cultures, people, stuff down, but by building yourselves up. And that is a pretty hard binary right there. I don't really do binaries a whole lot, like I don't think they usually work, but there is no way to build yourself up while putting the rest of humanity down. You can't have both. You can have the appearance of both for a little while, but you just can't have both. So it's not going to work. And that's about that. This is turning into a long video. I just want to talk about that, cultural nationalism. I'm reading a lot about specific types of that in terms of Buddhism and Confucianism and how those are related to Shintoism and Japanese, modern Japanese history, because there's some really interesting stuff there which gets into some of the, structural problems of Buddhism as a religion. Not necessarily as a practice, but the layers that have been added on to remove you from attainment of the practice, which is interesting study. And I thought I'd just talk about that a little bit. Cultural nationalism is a really big deal, and we all need to access that to some degree, like depending on your needs, in a positive sense. And having people outside of you tell you that it's bad or wrong is a sure sign that something's wrong with them, not you. Stick that in your hat and stay sideways.